In May 1945, 1 week after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, the Allies accepted the surrender of Nazi Germany and the war in Europe was finally over. The Nazis had been beaten and people all over Britain took to the streets to celebrate. But it's only fairly recently that we've discovered just how advanced Hitler's plans were for the world had the Nazis actually won the war. These were not just pipe dreams. These were detailed plans and preparations, and many of them had already been implemented. In fact, Hitler's twisted vision was well on its way to becoming a terrifying reality. So what exactly were Hitler's plans for a new world order? How would the Third Reich have been rolled out across the globe? And what would the world today have looked like if the Nazis had actually won the war? In this series, we'll look at the details of Hitler's plan for global domination, how the world he wanted to create would have been made possible not only through military might, but also by colossal infrastructure and building projects, how huge displacement and thought control were already well underway, and how the evil of Nazism would have shaped a very different world for all of us. On May the 8th, 1945, people all over Britain celebrated VE Day. After nearly 6 years, Nazi Germany had finally been beaten. During those celebrations, very few, if any, would have given much thought to what life in Britain would have been like had Hitler actually won the war. But in Germany, the Nazis had given it some thought. In fact, they'd given it a lot of thought. In pre-war Britain, Liverpool was a hugely important city. Its port served as a gateway to the Atlantic, providing the country with vital supplies such as food, fuel and raw materials. But it was also the scene of Nazi pre-war spying.
Liverpool was the second major port in Britain. It was known as the second city of the empire. It was very crucial to the trade between Britain and America, but it was also, of course, central to the Navy as well. For both those reasons, Liverpool was always going to be targeted by the Nazis. And if we look at the Nazi plans for invading Britain, you'll see that Liverpool comes out, very high on their list of targets.
Before the outbreak of the Second World War, Liverpool University took part in the Austauschdienst, or the German student exchange programme. Now, the students who arrived from Germany were put up by local families, and most were very eager to study and to learn while immersing themselves in British culture. But some of those who came over, including the student who stayed at this house, had ulterior motives. That student turned out to be the future SS officer Rudolf Tirolf. He came to Britain in 1929 to study at Liverpool as part of an Anglo-German student exchange programme. He enrolled himself in the law course, but most of his learning took place away from the classroom. Here in the university's Special Collections Archive, they still hold a copy of his student file. To tell me more about his time here, I've come to meet Dr. Miriam Wilkes-Heeg of Liverpool University's Department of History. Now, we know that Tirolf, by September 1940, puts together a pretty extensive report about his time in Liverpool. Why does he do it then, and do we know what was in it?
Well, I think he wrote a dossier about the staff at the university, so he pointed out, I think, that one of the heads of departments was Jewish, that another one was a Marxist socialist, and he also explained that he took a shining to one of them who was obviously expressing his love for all things German.
Right.
So these are the kind of things I think he put in his dossier.
So why does Tyrolf come to Liverpool? What's so interesting about Liverpool as a city?
Well, I mean, Liverpool was a vital place for the Germans. The Germans were really interested in Liverpool. It was the gateway for supplies. It was also a naval headquarters, and it was a place for shipbuilding, obviously. So lots of submarines were built in Birkenhead, and those were obviously also then the areas which were targeted by the Germans in the Second World War.
They had a huge espionage effort, both before and especially during the war. They had their embassy, they had their embassy staff, they had Germans working in Britain. Every German was potentially a spy, and very often was.
There weren't just people like young Rudolph here who were doing it. You hinted that there were other members, other students who were doing this. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, so the exchange program existed for, a number of years, and so quite a few Germans came to study in Liverpool throughout the 1930s. And then in 1938, when one student was caught actually rifling through the desk of a professor, and he was looking for information on German refugees, and he was caught. And after that, the exchange program was terminated.
It is fascinating to see this document, and it provides us with something very physical and tangible that we have about this young man who would then go on and become a captain, a Hauptsturmführer in the Gestapo, and use the intelligence he gathered just as a very young man, and it's there right in front of us. This proof, and it is fascinating. The information and intelligence gathered by Nazi pre-war spying in Liverpool would go on to be used against the city with devastating effect by the German Luftwaffe.
Like a number of other ports and industrial centres, I mean, Liverpool obviously was of interest to the Germans, and of course did suffer from the Blitz when that began in September 1940, and even before then, and the bombing in May and spring of 1941 was very heavy. The Blitz, of course, was intended to knock Britain out of the war and to attack places like Liverpool, important ports.
It wasn't just the universities that the Nazis were seeking to infiltrate as they planned their invasion of Great Britain. If you had been around in the late 1930s, and specifically in 1937, you would have seen lots of young German men cycling around Britain. These were members of the Hitler Youth, and they weren't on just some innocent touristical adventure. No, what they were doing was gathering as much intelligence as they could on the British Isles. They weren't cycling, they were spikling.
The Hitler Youth was really like a training ground for future soldiers, really, and also a kind of training ground in Nazi ideology. So they went on sort of hiking trips, camping trips. Some of the camping trips came to Britain as well. There was a kind of idea that they may have been engaged in spying for Britain, some of the older members of the Hitler Youth.
Recently declassified files showed that there was a real concern about these cycling tours. They show that MI5 had requested surveillance of these groups when it was discovered that a German cycling magazine had published an article which was thought to contain a message to all Nazi groups cycling in foreign countries. Impress on your memory the roads and paths, villages and towns, prominent church towers, and other landmarks so that you will not forget them. Make a note of the names and places, rivers, seas, and mountains. Perhaps you should be able to utilize these sometime for the benefit of the fatherland. But the Nazi pre-war spying activities would soon be over. As tensions continued to rise across Europe, peace seemed more and more unlikely. In September 1939, after the invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. However, by the following summer of 1940, the Germans had not only overrun the Low Countries of Holland and Belgium, but they had then stunned the world by forcing the French to their knees in just 46 days. That defeat was almost as humiliating for the British, as the invasion of France necessitated the famous evacuation of hundreds of thousands of troops from Dunkirk. Churchill had called the evacuation of Dunkirk a miracle and a deliverance. But it had also left his military in a weakened state, and it would be several months before Britain was once again combat ready.
Most of the British Army's heavy equipment, guns, even rifles, had been left behind at Dunkirk. All our defences were in very, very poor shape. We hadn't anticipated an invasion of this country. We'd seen the way that Holland had gone in 5 days and Belgium was collapsing under the weight of a German invasion. So Anthony Eden, Churchill's Secretary of State for War, calls into being the local defence volunteers, which Churchill insisted be changed to the Home Guard, now better known perhaps as Dad's Army.
The German army, with all its might, was at the gate. It had crushed all before it in just a few days, and Britain was next on the list. Invasion seemed inevitable, and so the country began making preparations to meet it.
I believe there was, in lots of areas of Britain at the time, a real fear that the Germans were going to invade.
I think the invasion fear was real. It seems as though Britain is on the edge of invasion.
They did have one weapon which was truly frightening, and that's the six-engined Gigant. At that time in 1940, just gliders, but later with 6 engines. They could carry about 200 men. That would have been a tough thing to deal with. And of course, they had perfected paratroop assault, the first people ready to do that, as they did on Crete. Everyone was holding their breath. They're expecting paratroops. They're expecting the worst, and it was a universal belief, actually. There was going to be an invasion, definitely.
German plan for invasion of England. Phase 1. Knock out the Royal Air Force and its bases. Get control of the air and the sea lanes across the channel.
They were right to be fearful, because the threat felt very real. Hitler had put into motion Operation Sealine, the long-planned invasion of Britain.
Well, Operation Sealine was the plan to invade Britain. Part fantasy, part propaganda, part reality. They did, of course, have equipment lined up. They had pontoons, landing craft, all of those things.
That really started after the fall of France with the German Navy, Air Force, and the German Army, and Rhine barges were assembled to carry over the troops, and exercises were conducted as well.
The Nazi plan to invade and occupy Britain has been seen by some as simply a threat that Hitler had no intention of carrying out. But here, at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, they hold a vast collection of documents that show how the Nazis' intention to capture Britain was planned with frightening detail. These don't just show landing points or where men and troops are stationed. What they show are the boring nuts and bolts of a country, the infrastructure. It's not as exciting as where submarines are or battleships, but actually it's vitally important if you want to control a country. This is the complete layout of Britain's electricity network. It runs all the way from Scotland right down to Cornwall to Kent. It has a detailed scheme of London, shows where all the underground cables are located. It also shows the strength of all the power stations, how much output they were doing. It's an immensely detailed map. And then what do we have here? We got this second map, even larger map, again produced at the height of the Battle of Britain, September 1940. And this is your complete guide to the telephone and telegraph network. On the other side, it also shows every radio station in Britain. Now, some people might say that, you know, radio stations, telegraph networks and electricity networks are boring and not particularly exciting. And actually what we really want to look at is landing sites and battleships and where troops are. I disagree. I think that infrastructure and the German knowledge of our infrastructure is absolutely chilling and shows how advanced their plans were. We, of course, already know the fate of other countries that were occupied and how some suffered worse than others. But what would life in Britain have looked like under Nazi control? Well, unfortunately, we already know. Now, it's often forgotten that the Nazis really did invade the British Isles. You probably think I've got my history spectacularly wrong, but let me assure you I haven't, because I'm on my way to the Channel Islands, which the Nazis did invade in 1940 and held on to for 5 long years. Now, it's absolutely essential that we go there, because if we have a look at what did happen on these small patches of British soil, we can get a really good idea of what would have happened had the Nazis occupied Great Britain at large.
Well, the Channel Islands are very important. If the British had continued to have them, they would have had a major strategic asset from which to launch attacks on Europe, commando raids, attacks on the French coast, all of those things. So it was actually quite important that Germany have those.
This is the island of Alderney, one of the smaller Channel Islands and the closest to mainland Britain. Today, it's a beautiful and peaceful island, but during the Second World War, Alderney was a very different place. To find out more about what happened here, I've come to meet historian and Alderney resident Dr. Trevor Davenport. Why were the Channel Islands invaded, and why did Hitler even bother to do so?
Well, of course, after he'd conquered France, he saw the Channel Islands as a potential, well, military area, really, to help defend the Channel from his point of view. But the other reason is, of course, he really wanted to capture British soil, because it would have been a nice feather in his cap.
The Nazis would have put into place very, very similar policies to those that they had in place at home. So there was always an ideal community that Hitler was trying to achieve. He had his methods and aims and ways of achieving that. And I think, given the opportunity, he would have applied those anywhere.
Well, it was an enormous shock because it looked like Britain. You had the familiar images of policemen and little red telephone kiosks, suddenly surrounded by stormtrooper types.
And of course, the Germans played it for all they're worth. As one looks at the newsreel film at the time of the British Bobby talking to a German Luftwaffe officer, the bands marching past Lloyd's Bank, that type of thing.
He built a massive amount of bunkers for such a tiny island. And he ended up building 5 artillery batteries, 13 strong points, of which we're in one here, 12 resistance nests, 3 defense lines, and 32,000 mines on this island, and 23 anti-aircraft batteries.
Who built all these fortifications?
So most of them, the big bunkers, were built by the forced laborers, and the breakwater was repaired by them. Tunnels were drilled by them, but I would say probably 90% of the work over it was done by the forced laborers.
And that must have come at a huge human cost.
It did. It came at a great human cost. I mean, 400 died here. And when you consider 400 out of 4,000, that's 10%.
The Nazis fully believed that Britain would try and regain control of their territories, and they set about heavily fortifying the islands, which could have been used as staging posts for any future invasion of Britain. Even today, Alderney is littered with bunkers, turrets and observation posts, most of which were constructed by forced labour. On Alderney, there were 4 camps alone dedicated to holding these prisoners. The most notorious of these was Lager Sylt. It's extraordinary to think that here on Alderney, the Germans operated 4 camps, 3 work camps and 1 SS concentration camp. It's thought that the total inmate population numbered about 6,000, although that number fluctuated. What is certain is that between January 1942, when some of the camps here began operating, and 1944, when they were closed, more than 700 people were killed. That figure could be a lot higher, but we'll never know for sure. Camp Sylt was commanded by a man called Maximilian List, who was your typical nasty piece of SS work. Alderney was a plum posting for him. He had his own villa built right on the outskirts of the camp, and it had a lovely view of the channel. And behind it, he even had built his own tunnel. Well, this is the tunnel built by List in order to connect his villa behind me through to the main part of the camp which he ran. Now, he built this tunnel as a private entrance to the camp, which meant that he could come down here maybe any time of the day, and he would then secretly appear at will and thereby frighten the prisoners. Life at Lager Sylt was brutal and inhumane. There were reports from witnesses stating that many of the prisoners, clothed in tattered striped uniforms, were either lame or crippled, with many of them forced to work in bare feet. It seemed as if the cruelty of the guards knew no bounds. Their rations were pitiful. They had half a litre of soup in the morning, half a litre of soup in the evening, and they had to do a full day's work on the quarries and building concrete fortifications. And of course, if they didn't do their work, they were executed. It's possible to imagine all sorts of horrible things that happened here. It is, after all, the site of an SS concentration camp. And we know of one specific incident that took place right on these gates behind me. A young 18-year-old Russian prisoner decided to run away. He wanted to go back home, which is, of course, impossible. And when he was caught by the SS, he was strung up, crucified between these 2 gate posts and left to die overnight on a cold December night. But what makes this story even worse is that the SS commandant decided to drench him in freezing cold water. So, of course, he then froze to death here on these very posts. There are even accounts that claimed that once the prisoners were no longer fit for purpose by being able to work, they were simply taken to Alderney's half-a-mile-long breakwater and thrown into the sea to be swept away by the tides.
Well, I think that a number of historians have debated, really, whether an occupation by the Germans of the British Isles would have resembled that of the German occupation of the Channel Islands. Undoubtedly, I think, there would have been concentration camps, and some of the plans for occupation of Britain were really quite ruthless.
Back on the home front during the first few months of the war, few would have had any idea of the horrors of the concentration camps. Instead, they would have been trying to adjust to the realities of living in wartime Britain. And very few, if any, had any inkling of what would have lain in store for Britain had Hitler successfully crossed the Channel. In the event of a full-scale invasion, key members of the British establishment would most likely have fled the country, including our own royal family.
The royal family would have gone to Canada, and so would the government, and the war would have continued. From there, it would not have been the end of the war, but Britain would have been under German occupation, and a quisling government would have been found.
While what was left of the British government may have continued to operate and fight the occupation in exile, Hitler would have installed his own government in Britain. But surprisingly, it wouldn't have been made up of Nazis, but Britons themselves.
Whether a sort of a Vichy-style regime would have been established in Britain with the Germans occupying key spots but allowing a British government, probably under Lloyd George, Sir Samuel Hoare, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor back on the throne, as a lot of people have speculated, whether that would have been what the German occupation would have been like.
After France had fallen to Nazi Germany in 1940, the country in the south was governed by a regime known as Vichy France. The Nazis had allowed the Vichy government to exist on the condition that they aligned their interests with those of Nazi Germany. Could the same style of regime have lain in store for a conquered Britain?
Hitler wanted to preserve British democracy. He said the British just can't become fascists, it's just not in their culture. So we'll have the parties continue.
They'd have a series of regional governments, one of them based in the southeast, the biggest one, Birmingham was cited, Manchester, Yorkshire, and they had a Scottish centre of government as well, and Northern Ireland. So they were going to sort of run it like they did in Germany itself. They have a federal system in Germany. They were going to do it like that, have what were called GAUs in Britain, with various kind of pro-Nazi governors who would rule these areas in conjunction with the Nazis.
We were considered, of course, an Aryans, and Germanic cousins, and that might have been in our favour or might not. I think the Germans have a motto or quotation, "Be my brother or I'll bash your head in." And that was certainly, I think, the Nazi philosophy as regards Britain.
Another real concern was the fate of the country's publicly owned art collections and the priceless masterpieces that hung in the National Gallery. Having seen how the Nazis had bombed museums and looted from the countries they had occupied, Britain established a plan to have the nation's treasures moved to various secret locations. Abandoned mines and quarries were used to store countless paintings by some of the world's greatest artists, in an attempt to keep them safe and out of the hands of the occupying forces.
Hitler would have paid a visit to London, there's no doubt, with people like Arno Breker, who is his court sculptor. There's the famous picture of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower, but on his right, the man in the leather who looks like a Gestapo agent is in fact a famous sculptor. I really do feel that maybe the Elgin marbles might have traveled across the North Sea and ended up in Berlin.
But not only would our art have been under threat, but also many of Britain's most iconic buildings.
Hitler, of course, was madly passionate about architecture. Architecture was his baby, his fetish. He would have taken a certain interest in some of the grandest and most monumental buildings.
Blenheim Palace was earmarked as the headquarters of the Nazi occupation. Stately homes in the New Forest would have housed high-ranking Nazi officials, with Eton and other private schools used for the education of their children. Blackpool was even suggested as a rest and recreation centre for troops. But what about Hitler himself? Where would he have called home on his visits to newly occupied Britain?
This is Bridgnorth in Shropshire.
It's a lovely, sleepy town with a really rich history. It's got a ruined castle and a museum that tells of its really rather dramatic part in the English Civil War. And I'm sure that most of its 12,000-odd residents would confirm it's a really agreeable place to live. Well, by all accounts, Adolf Hitler thought so as well, because this is where he's supposed to have planned to set up his home during his visits to newly conquered Britain. It may not seem like an obvious place for Hitler to base himself, but Bridgnorth is located right in the middle of England and had excellent transport links by rail and even a nearby airfield. It was also rumoured that Hitler would have used Apley Hall as his personal residence. It's funny to think when you're sitting here how, this very church, which has got St George's Cross up at the top and not a swastika, how this could have been a very, very different place indeed. Marching up the hill we've just walked up, there could have been German soldiers with their jackboots clamping all the way up here. And behind me coming out of there, you might expect a bride and groom, but it could have been, a man in SS uniform getting married to his British sweetheart. It would have been a very different place indeed. In many respects, Britain would have been no different to any of the other countries that were occupied. Just as they had done elsewhere, the Nazis would have implemented their doctrine with immediate effect. This now brings us on to the Black Book. This is a highly sinister document, and it contains the names of all those the Nazis considered dangerous and subversive. There are exactly 2,820 names on this list, and all of them were earmarked for immediate arrest. I've come to the Imperial War Museum in London to meet historian Terry Charman, who's agreed to show me a very rare document in their collection.
Well, it contains nearly 3,000 names of personalities that were going to be taken into protective custody by the Nazis had the invasion of Britain, Operation Sealine, proved successful. But it also, of course, includes a lot of British personalities like Churchill, Anthony Eden, Duff Cooper, the most prominent three anti-appeasers, plus Neville Chamberlain, the appeaser himself, plus some very strange personalities to find in an arrest list like this.
Can we have a look at some of those bigger names you're talking about? I think it's
Winston Spencer, Minister President, and he was to be found at Westerham, Kent, Chartwell Manor.
Noel Coward, why is he on the list?
Well, Noel Coward, I think, is on the list because during the period of the Phoney War, the first 9 months of the war, Coward was working with the French, liaising with the French on propaganda exercise in Paris. And I think that obviously this was picked up on, that he was all swaggering down the Rue de Rivoli wearing a naval uniform. That was one claim. The writer, Nancy Cunard, whose mother, Lady Cunard, actually was one of von Ribbentrop's favourite hostesses when he was ambassador in London, ironically. She's on the list there.
Although we have some quite famous names, we've also got some quite obscure ones, men just described as businessmen in Riga. Who are these people?
Well, in November 1939, there was the famous or infamous incident at Venlo, where the Nazis kidnapped two British secret agents quite high up. It is assumed that in their interrogations, some of these names slipped out.
And these are names of?
People that were in the British Secret Service, MI6.
MI6 agents.
Yes.
So actually there are some very, very important names the Nazis here. They're not just politicians or sort of leading figures in society. They're actually intelligence officers as well.
Yes. Their subsequent fate was measured by what happened to their sort of people similar to them in occupied Poland, because there was a listing that the Nazis had made of Polish personalities that were marked for, well, death, basically.
So all 3,000 or so people in this book would have ended up in concentration camps, and then you think almost certainly would have been killed?
Yes, yes.
It's very easy to surmise from what we know about the history of Nazi Germany and Hitler's aims and plans and policies that he would have rounded up and deported the Jews and others that he didn't like the look of, that he would have also exterminated the asylum population. So he murdered the mentally and physically handicapped in Germany. There's no reason why he wouldn't have done the same in any of the places that he took over.
You could imagine that there'd be the knock in the night, Gestapo vans screaming around London, rounding up these people, sending them to a concentration camp.
In 1940, the threat of a Nazi occupation of Britain seemed all too real. So I'm on my way to Oxfordshire, where I'm going to go and see a highly secret training camp that was set up in order to combat the occupation. The village of Coles Hill was once home to the headquarters of a Second World War military group called the Auxiliary Unit, also known as the AU. In the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill, worried about the threat of invasion, called for the formation of a unit of guerrilla fighters who, in the event of an invasion, would wage a secret war against the occupying forces.
They were a kind of almost kamikaze units to make life hell for the invader by shooting their senior officers, by blowing things up, by sabotage through plastic explosive, make life utterly horrible.
The AU worked in cells consisting of 4 to 8 men who were often farmers, gamekeepers, or even poachers, selected for their unparalleled knowledge of the area. To keep them hidden, the Royal Engineers constructed specially equipped hideouts from which they could launch their attacks. These were known as operational bases. Tom Sykes is part of the Coles Hill Auxiliary Research Team, and his father was an actual serving member of the AU.
The operational bases were always in secluded areas where the public didn't normally go. And they weren't normally on a footpath, they were somewhere hidden in the woods. And each operational base may have had an observation post where they had one man looking out to see if there were any German patrols and the like.
The observation post was selected for its clear views of the surrounding area, allowing the AU to conduct a reconnaissance on the Nazis and to keep the enemy in view as they approached. You can almost imagine this being the view where you would have seen, say, a German patrol, where it is now.
Some of these would have been sighted near roads, also close to their bases, but near a road, and they can make notes of convoy movement.
Got it. OK, so they're spying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would then be able to report their findings back to the nearby operational base. Now, Bill, you assure me that somewhere around here is an operational base.
Yes.
Would you mind showing it to me?
My pleasure.
It's somewhere down there, is it?
Yep.
Really? Oh my God, this is like sort of magic, really. I can't believe this. This is absolutely extraordinary. It's actually got the weeds on top of it. It's that realistic. Suddenly there's this huge kind of cave has emerged. It's about 15 foot deep. Here I go. First step down. Here I go down into this incredibly quite tight little tunnel, little shaft. I guess they were smaller back then. Right. Doing my best to squeeze through this gap that's made for smaller men than me. Each patrol was expected to be self-contained and self-sufficient. They were equipped with pistols, knives, machine guns and plastic explosives, and enough food and water to last 2 weeks, because that was probably all they would ever need.
They're actually told you'll only have a life of 12 days, and then if they capture you, going to capture you, shoot yourself.
High on their list of targets were aircraft, railways, fuel depots, and high-ranking Nazis.
Churchill said, you know, you can always take one with you. That was his philosophy, meaning you can always take a German soldier, you know, kill him even if you know, his companions killed you.
Why is it so tight there?
It's two things. If a grenade is dropped down after you, this is a blast wall.
Okay.
Will protect you. It's narrow so that anybody that's got wearing equipment, they can't get through quickly.
Bill, this is a pretty tight little space, really, isn't it? It must have been pretty horrible for 6 blokes being in here for day after day.
Yes, and they were having to wash, they're having to cook, having to go to the toilet, everything down here. So although there are 1 or 2 holes letting air in, there's basically one out in the galley that was venting out an upper tree.
Oh, right, so all the smells, such as condensation from our bodies, cooking, anything like that, all would have disappeared.
Yeah.
So, Bill, if the Germans did raid, how would I disappear? Because that seems to be the only...
Try that door.
Oh, OK. Oh, there's a tunnel.
That's it.
All right, well, I'm going to use it then. I'll leave you to it, Bill.
OK.
Well, I'm glad to get out of there. It's nasty, it's cramped, it's horrible. You know, one level, though, it does feel like, you know, I've had a bit of a lark in there, you know, and it feels like you're a boy playing camps in the woods. But actually, this was real. This is a real tunnel. That was a real bunker built by men who thought that this country would not only be invaded, but occupied. This is men playing war games, real games. By 1944, there were over 500 of these bases across Britain. But the turning tide of the war meant that they never actually became operational.
Many of them actually then, later on in the war, because the auxiliary units were stood down in 44, many of them then joined the invasion of Europe as regular soldiers.
By 1944, the Nazis were on the back foot. The successful Allied landing on Normandy would spell defeat for Germany on the Western Front, which, combined with Russia's triumph on the Eastern Front, meant that Germany would be completely defeated. Scenes of celebration broke out across Britain. Those lucky enough had survived the war, and their way of life had been preserved from the threat of Nazi extremism. But other countries weren't so lucky. In the places he did conquer, Hitler was able to put his plans into motion and started to build an extremely dark new world.
In uns, was wir Zeit und hinter uns